go to paradise and get sick, right? I got sick on the plane. It's right from the plane, I think. Anyhow, on the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work. His most recent book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website, democracyatwork.info and rdwolff.com, and you can tweet him at democracy@WRK or at Prof. Wolff, PROFWOLFF. Dr. Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
It's always great having you with us. So we've got this looming tariff trade war going on, and the stock market seems to be a little jumpy. I don't know if there's a relationship between the two. I've been thinking that the stock market has been driven on its upward trajectory in part by $1 trillion being given to these massive corporations, and they're using most of it, with the GOP tax scam, and they're using most of it to simply buy back their own shares to increase their stock value because they pay their executives with stock. To what extent, what are your thoughts on what the state of our economy is right now, and the parts of it, at least, that are in the news?
Well, I think there are many factors that are converging on making the stock market nervous. The folks down in Wall Street that I talked to confirm that, yes, they're troubled by the erratic behavior of the president. On the other hand, that's been a consistent story for over 15 months now, so that, in a sense, it's not quite as upsetting as it might be. Their basic take on that is, by the way, that he says things, then his advisors explain to him that either he was mistaken or he can't do that, or the blowback from it is too risky politically, and then he backs away. The troops were to leave Syria last week. Now they're going to stay in Syria. The tariffs were to be imposed immediately. Now it's a discussion, and it won't happen until May or June, if it happens at all, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to look beyond that to see some of the troubles for the stock market. By far the most important one is this. We have economic downturns in the history of capitalism, both America and in other countries. Every 4 to 7 years, there's a downturn. That's been a pretty steady rule as an average. It doesn't mean that each one is that length. But if you count from the depths of the last downturn, roughly 2009, maybe early 2010, and you add the number 4 to 7, we're due for one. And there's a great fear that the longer we wait, the harder we'll fall when the time comes. So that's a big one. The second one is, of all the people to pick a trade war with, the United States to pick a trade war with China is extremely foolhardy, since the Chinese economy is now second only to the United States. And if they show a willingness to retaliate, which they have already shown, well, then it's an open-ended question how far this craziness will go, how far Mr. Trump and his people are prepared to push this, how far the Chinese leadership, trying to look tough just like the president in the United States is, how far they'll push it. And sometimes these things outrun the ability of the fixers to control it, and that also weighs on the stock market as a kind of wild card that could upend and transform many industries in the United States, particularly those hit by tariffs.
So how would that upending and transformation play out?
Well, you could see, to give you an example, the United States sells a disproportionate amount of soybeans, a very important crop in this country, particularly in the agricultural parts that have been strong supporters for Mr. Trump. They look to lose their single most important market, China. What happens to these farms that are heavily indebted, include huge agribusiness companies that banks are dependent on? If they can't sell to China, it's not clear they can sell to anybody else. The Chinese will have to find other crops or other sources for their soybeans. They will look around. That will improve the outlook for farmers elsewhere in the world, but it will hurt American farms. It's not clear what that means. the Chinese will not buy American Boeing aircraft. That upends that company and its industry and all the industries that feed into it. So nobody knows anymore how to calculate what it's going to mean. And the impact of the Chinese, if we really go to the mat on this stuff, is much greater than the impact of what Mr. Trump says. And you can see how that upends the stock market too. So when you add all of these potential uncertain crises to the underlying story that we're kind of due for an economic downturn in this unstable system anyway, well, then you can see why the stock market is jittery and volatile and bouncing all over the place.
Well, it sounds like what we're talking about here is basically kind of a reboot. I mean, if you just go back 30 years, I lived for a month in China in November of 1986 in Beijing. I was studying acupuncture there. And they were importing virtually no soybeans from the United States at that point in time. It was, there wasn't a single high-rise in town. The tallest building was the Hyatt or Hilton Hotel on the outskirts of town that was 10 stories high and had a nice restaurant on the top floor that I went to and ate at once. But in fact, took the doctor who was teaching me acupuncture out for dinner, and she was shocked because our dinner cost more than her annual salary. So, I think that at a certain level, what Trump is saying, and frankly, what some, progressives are saying, Sherrod Brown, for example, running for re-election in the Senate in Ohio, is that, the 30 years ago wasn't that long ago, and we had a much more independent system in the United States, economic system, and we could, if necessary, fight World War II and be self-sufficient. I guess self-sufficiency is the word I was looking for. That if we were to somehow go back to that, it brings back our factories, it brings back our businesses. In the 2 minutes we have, your thoughts on the reality of that kind of thinking.
It's the cows or the horses have gotten out of the barn, and you can't, you can close the door all you want, but it's too little and it's too late. Look, it's American corporations who over the last 30, 40 years decided to make more profits by moving production out of the United States and more to China than anywhere else. They didn't do that for any other reason than they could get away with paying Chinese workers way less than they paid American workers and pocket the difference as their profits. That's why if you act now, you are, as I said, the barn door is closed. You are already dependent for the consumer goods that most of us have, our clothing, our appliances, our automobile parts. It comes from China. That was, by the way, not a decision the Chinese made because they couldn't have done this on their own. They did it with the active collaboration of the United States, who moved the manufacturing over there, and then the biggest American company, Walmart, became the seller of those Chinese goods, produced half by American companies, half by local Chinese. But they couldn't have done that either unless Walmart distributed to the American people on a mass basis all of that product. So the United States' biggest businesses have been in the process of creating this interdependent economy so that when Mr. Trump comes along, and it would be true of anyone else either, and proposes to stop the interdependence by somehow reverting backwards, he is threatening those companies and all the investments they've made, which is why it can't go forward. And beyond being political theater, playing to his base, he can't really get this done.
So we're still on the air here with Free Speech TV and our nonprofit stations, and it sounds like the only way to essentially deconstruct what started in the this was the big debate in the election of 1992, where Ross Perot was saying the giant sucking sound from the South, and talked a little bit about Asia, but I don't think anybody at that point in time. That was 5 years after I was living in Beijing, or studying in Beijing, that both Clinton and Bush were fully in favor of this, and Ross Perot was going, you guys are crazy, but we've gone down this road to back out of China now, to pull American manufacturing out of China now and restore it to the United States. would be a major wrenching change that would be undoing 30 or 40 years of transition that was relatively gradual, it seems, doing it very quickly. Is that even remotely possible or desirable, for that matter?
Well, it's like beauty. It's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. Is it doable? Sure, but it is a draconian step. It will destabilize the entire world economy. It is an existential threat to the Chinese. And let's remember, they are the biggest country in this world that we have. They are possessed of nuclear weapons. There's no reason to think if you back them into a corner, they will not behave the way other countries have if they've been backed into an existentially threatening corner. It will cost America all kinds of economic stress. Given the way our culture and our politics works, that stress will be pushed off of those at the top onto those at the middle and the bottom. They are already an angry part of this population. Otherwise, Mr. Trump wouldn't have been elected. So you're putting stresses on an already unstable, destabilized America, as well as other parts of the world. Going down that path for the political aggrandizement of the people running Washington seems to be one of the craziest things the human race has ever done to itself, if that were to actually happen. My guess is it won't, that there are too many interests that are geared up to avoid that, to permit Mr. Trump to do more than political play acting. Let me give you a very concrete example, because I noticed that Mr. Kudlow, the new economic advisor who replaced Gary Cohn, is talking like this about how the Chinese over the last 10, 20 years, quote, haven't been playing by the rules. It's quite correct. The Chinese manipulate international trade to their own advantage. The problem with Mr. Kudlow is that every other country does that as well, led by the United States. This notion that the Chinese are doing something unusual, exceptional, out of the path of rules governed behavior, that's really nonsense. And the example I like to give is that of the trucking industry. In 1963, the United States imposed a tariff on foreign trucks.
Professor Richard Wolff is on the line with us. Prof. Wolff is his Twitter handle, and of course, democracy at WRK for Twitter, democracy@work.info, and rdwolff.com. Professor Wolff, we're talking about, what do we do with the situation with China, and how we have become essentially dependent upon China, and this dependency has been fostered by American corporations moving there with the complicity or the encouragement of our politicians from, in a big way starting in the 90s with George Herbert Walker Bush and the Reagan administration and Bill Clinton. You were giving an example of how we got here, and so please go for it.
Yeah, my point was that it is inappropriate and inaccurate to get angry at the Chinese for manipulating international trade to their advantage, because every country does that, and the United States has always done it. So what you're really trying to do here is to rearrange the way we're all doing it to advantage one side to another, and you can't bully the Chinese anymore. They're too strong and too big to do that, which puts Mr. Trump in an impossible situation to go beyond theatrics. The example I wanted to give was the trucking industry here in the United States. In 1963, the United States put a tariff of 25% on trucks, compared to 2.5% on cars. That 25% tariff on trucks is still in effect 50 years later. It's why we have the truck fetish in the United States, because by putting a 25% tariff, you kept cheap trucks, perfectly good, cheap trucks made in Europe or Asia, out of the American market by and large, because they couldn't afford to be sold here since they had to carry that absurd 25% tariff. So American car companies, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and so on, began to produce trucks and began to advertise trucks so that manly folks thought that having a truck was some kind of identity.
Oh, so you're not talking about like 18-wheelers. You're talking about Ford F-150s.
Yeah, the pickup trucks, you know, the Silverado, the F-Series, that's right. And those became cultural icons with heavy advertising. That's not because people liked trucks back then, which used to be a utility vehicle. It had to become an identity for people. It had to be pushed because the profit underneath the protection of that tariff was so enormous that they have now become the most profitable vehicle that American car companies make. People, that has nothing to do with efficiency, which it isn't. It has nothing to do with saving gas guzzling, because trucks use too much of it. It's not good for the environment because gas guzzling trucks pollute. It's profitable because it's protected by a tariff. The Chinese didn't do that. The American governments did, Republicans and Democrats alike. It's typical. We have quotas on sugar. We have lots of protections that industries have won from pliant politicians that they control anyway. The Chinese have been doing similar things to advantage their economy and probably their favored industries. What Mr. Trump is therefore doing is trying to jiggle around these things to get a bit more advantage for what? For the United States? No. But for those people who can get to him to protect their particular industry or their particular goods. And that's what this is about. And if
it seems like it's
to a trade war, it will really disrupt.
It seems like it's fairly theatrical. We have about 2 minutes to the break here,
right.
To the end of the segment. I've got another guest coming up. But you know, on the other side, Peter Lighthizer, for example, Trump's trade advisor, would say, but we're in a situation now where we can't build a cruise missile or a battleship without Chinese parts. And if we end up in a conflict with China, we're screwed as a country. I mean, isn't there an argument to be made for self-sufficiency?
Yeah, the problem is, you know, you would have had to think about that before you gave your corporations the freedom to use profits as the calculation. If you really want to introduce questions like self-sufficiency, which then opens the space for what other criteria ought to govern where you invest your money and how you invest it. Maybe we shouldn't use profit because it's gotten us into a terrible place in terms of lack of self-sufficiency. I would argue that profit has also given us an inequality that is beyond sustainability in our culture, that is undermining our democracy. Yes, I think this is part of a critique of allowing the market and profit seeking to be the dominant governing principle. Excuse me?
How do we unwind it? How do we unwind it?
We have to come up with a different organization of our economy that doesn't make profit the beginning and end of the conversation. If we don't do that,
isn't that just as disruptive?
Into one dead end after another.
But wouldn't that be just as disruptive as pulling out?
Yes, but the end result might be a lot better. We're now going to get disruption without dealing with the underlying profit-driven cause of it all, and we will shift from one profit-driven system to another. My argument is, yeah, let's do the disruption, which we're going to have in any case, but let's do it in the interest of a reorganization that might be a way forward.
Remarkable. Remarkable. You can read all about it. Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown, and all the other great writings of Professor Richard Wolff at democracyatwork.info, rdwolff.com. Dr. Wolff, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you, and I look forward to the next time.